Daniel Morgan, 38, had once been a combat medic during the brutal Fallujah campaign. That was 5 years ago, but the memories still burned bright, quite literally. He had been severely burned while heroically pulling a fellow soldier from a Humvee engulfed in flames after an IED strike. The explosion had left half of his face and neck permanently scarred, like a roadmap of suffering etched deeply into his skin. Those scars told a story of bravery, of sacrifice, of pain. But most people didn't want to hear it. Most people just stared. After receiving his medical discharge, Daniel disappeared from the military world. He turned his back on the veterans groups, avoided the reunions, and stepped away from the brotherhood that might have provided comfort. Why? Because he couldn't bear the looks anymore, the pity, the curiosity, the horror. He settled instead in a quiet riverside town, deliberately choosing a place where no one would know his name, his past, or what he'd endured. He found a job at the Riverside Diner, a small, sleepy little place where he could earn a modest living while keeping interactions as short and impersonal as possible. Every single day, Daniel endured the same cruel routine, the stares, the whispers, the way parents would instinctively pull their children closer when he approached with their food. Could they not see the humanity beneath the scars? Didn't they know he once saved lives? But he had learned to adapt. He developed a method. Approach tables from the right side, his less scarred side, speak briefly, place the dishes down gently, and retreat before they could react. It was a dance of invisibility. His manager, Mike, had initially been hesitant to place Daniel in front of house duties. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable in the kitchen," he'd said. But Daniel had refused. He didn't want to hide, not completely. He needed to feel useful, even if it meant subjecting himself to daily judgment. Then came that particular Saturday afternoon. It started like any other. Daniel was balancing a tray of drinks when he heard it, snickering. A group of teenagers from the local high school were sitting at a booth, nudging each other, pointing discreetly. One boy, maybe 16, raised his phone and pretended to take a selfie. But Daniel knew the truth. He could feel the lens capturing his profile. "Check this out," the boy whispered to his friends. "Straight out of a horror movie." The words sliced through Daniel like a knife. He heard everything. Since the explosion, his hearing had become unusually sharp, like his body was trying to compensate for what had been lost. But the cost of that gift? Having to hear the cruelty in high-definition clarity. He kept walking, his face a mask of nothingness, his grip on the tray steady, even as humiliation burned in his chest. Sitting nearby was Carl Wilson, a retired Army sergeant, having dinner with his teenage son, Alex. They were discussing college applications when Carl noticed Daniel delivering water to a nearby table. His eyes narrowed as Daniel reached forward and his sleeve pulled back just enough to reveal a tattoo, one that sent Carl's fork clattering against his plate. It was the medic's cross, intertwined with a specific unit designation, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Fallujah. His unit. Carl's gaze drifted to Daniel's face, taking in the scars, seeing beyond them to the man underneath. Recognition hit him like a punch to the chest. Could it really be him? "Dad?" Alex asked, sensing the shift in his father's demeanor. "What's wrong?" Carl said nothing. He just watched. His son and the other teens were still snickering. Another photo had been taken. That was enough. Carl reached across the table and grabbed his son's wrist, pushing the phone down with quiet authority. "Alex," he said, his voice tight with restrained fury, "you just did the worst thing I've ever seen you do." The boy looked stunned. "It's just a picture, Dad. For laughs." Carl didn't blink. His eyes stayed on Daniel's retreating form. "That man isn't who you think. Not even close. If you believe in decency, if you believe a good person deserves to be remembered, you'll sit here." Quietly. Carl Wilson had served 18 years before retiring. He'd been a platoon sergeant during the same operations in Fallujah where Daniel had served as a combat medic. They hadn't served in the same company, but everyone knew his story. Daniel had been the docile who ran into enemy fire to carry out 4 wounded Marines. He'd gone back into a burning vehicle, his own body aflame, just to save more lives. The last man he pulled out? Lieutenant James Wilson, Carl's eldest son. James had lived. He still walked with a limp, but he lived because of Daniel. And now, unbelievably, the same man was serving coffee in a small-town diner mocked by kids who had no idea what he'd endured. What kind of world had they become? "Give me your phone," Carl said firmly. "Dad, come on. Now." Alex handed it over. Carl deleted the photos, stood up, and marched toward the manager's station, where Mike was flipping through receipts. "Excuse me," Carl said. "The waiter with the burn scars? Can I speak to him? Privately?" Mike looked uneasy. "Daniel's on shift. Is there a problem with your service?" "No problem," Carl replied. "I need to thank him for something that happened a long time ago." Mike disappeared into the kitchen, returning shortly with a frown. "He says he doesn't want to talk. He's private about his past." Carl nodded slowly. He understood. Sometimes men who had seen what Daniel had preferred anonymity over praise. So he scribbled his name and number on a napkin and said, "Please give him this. Tell him it's from Lieutenant Wilson's father. He'll understand." That evening, Carl sat at his computer, staring at a blank post on a private Facebook group for veterans of the Iraq campaigns. Then he began typing. "Today I saw a hero being mocked while wearing a waiter's uniform. The Dots who saved my son and others during Operation Phantom Fury is serving meals in my hometown, enduring ridicule for the scars he earned saving Marines' lives. What have we become when we fail to recognize the cost of service, even when it's standing right in front of us?" By midnight, that post had been shared nearly 200 times. By morning, it had reached thousands: veterans, military families, active duty members across 3 states. Meanwhile, those teens had uploaded their mocking photos of Daniel online. But they had no idea of the storm they were about to unleash. Within hours, the images were flooded with outraged comments from the military community. "That's combat medic Daniel Morgan," wrote one furious user. "You're mocking a man who saved more lives in one day than you'll likely affect in your lifetime. Daniel had no idea any of this was happening. He showed up for his Sunday shift like always, head down, eyes averted, but something felt different." People were watching him, yes, but not with revulsion. There was something else. Was it respect? That afternoon, a letter arrived at the diner addressed simply to Doc Morgan. Inside was a handwritten note. "You carried me 2 kilometers under enemy fire when both my legs were shattered. If you're washing dishes, I'll gladly mop floors. Some debts can never be repaid." A grateful Marine. Mike placed the letter on the break room table, staring at it with wide eyes. His understanding of Daniel, the quiet man with the haunted eyes, shifted with each passing second. Then came Monday morning. At 7 a.m., a dozen men and women in military dress uniforms sat scattered throughout the diner. They came in quietly, choosing different tables, each placing a small card next to their water glass that simply read, "Thank you, Doc." By 8, there were twice as many. The usually sleepy diner buzzed with the quiet dignity of service members in perfect posture, voices low but respectful. Daniel walked in at 8:30, pausing at the door, confused. Uniforms everywhere, a sea of them. His heart raced. His first instinct was to bolt, to run from the attention. But something, maybe pride, maybe hope, kept him rooted. Mike approached, voice shaking. "Daniel, these people, they're here for you. I didn't know who you were." Daniel said nothing. He moved like clockwork into the break room, tied on his apron, and got to work. His hands trembled as he poured water, but his expression remained calm. As he approached the first table, a gunnery sergeant stood and snapped a flawless salute. Mike, the manager who just a few days earlier had sheepishly suggested Daniel stick to the back of the house because his scars made some customers uncomfortable, now stood tall in front of a bank of local news cameras. His voice shook slightly, not with fear, but with a mixture of pride and regret, as he declared how deeply honored the Riverside Diner was to employ such a hero. The very same Daniel Morgan whose quiet presence had once gone unnoticed, even criticized, was now the soul of the diner, and people were starting to see it. That same morning, Carl Wilson returned, this time not alone but with both of his sons. Beside him walked James Wilson, the Marine lieutenant whose life Daniel had once saved in a night of smoke, fire, and chaos. James moved slowly, his limp pronounced but steady, each step carrying a gravity that words couldn't match. When he finally stood face to face with Daniel, time seemed to pause. "You probably don't remember me," James began, his voice gentle, a mix of admiration and awe. Daniel looked at him, his eyes calm but sharp with memory. Third vehicle in the convoy, he said quietly. Fractured femur and shrapnel wounds to the lower back. You kept trying to stand up, even with your leg broken. James's eyes widened, emotion catching in his throat. Without hesitation, the two men embraced, not just as comrades, but as survivors, as brothers connected through pain and sacrifice. Cameras clicked rapidly, trying to capture the exact moment the past met the present in a simple hug that spoke more than any interview could. Then came Alex, the teenager who had so thoughtlessly mocked Daniel with cruel photos and careless whispers. His face was flushed red, his hands twitching slightly at his sides as he took a hesitant step forward. James gave his brother a gentle nudge, signaling it was time. Alex has something to say to you, he said, his tone firm but forgiving. Alex's eyes met Daniel's, barely holding his gaze. I'm sorry, he mumbled, voice cracking. I didn't know. I was stupid and cruel. There's no excuse. Daniel didn't scowl, didn't turn away. Instead, he studied Alex's face with a kind of quiet patience. I forgive you, he said softly but clearly. Just remember, no one chooses how they get wounded, but we all choose how we treat each other afterward. Wow, what a powerful thing to say, right? That line seemed to settle over the diner like a warm breeze after a storm, and as the afternoon sun filtered through the windows, something incredible began to unfold. The viral photos once meant to shame Daniel had now been replaced online by new ones. Snapshots of him surrounded by fellow veterans, shaking hands with James, serving tables with the same quiet dignity he always had. Only now, people truly saw him, not as a freak, not as a tragedy, but as a man who had lived through fire and returned to serve in an entirely new way. During a lull in the shift, Mike approached Daniel again, his voice thick with sincerity. Daniel, I need to apologize, he began. When customers complained about your appearance, I should have stood up for you. Instead, I asked you to work fewer front-of-house shifts. I was wrong. Daniel didn't need a long speech. He simply nodded. He understood. Forgiveness, after all, wasn't about words. It was about truth. That evening, as Daniel wiped down the last few tables, Mike hung a new sign right beside the entrance. The bold letters read, Proud to have American heroes on our staff. Medal of Honor nominee Daniel Morgan serves here. Can you imagine walking into a diner and seeing that? Carl Wilson lingered as the place emptied out, waiting for a moment of privacy. Why here, he asked, his tone curious but respectful. With your record, you could be working in Washington, with veterans groups, military hospitals, anywhere. So why here? Daniel paused, wiping his hands on his apron. Because here I'm just Daniel, he replied quietly. Not a sad story, not a recruitment poster, not a reminder of the worst day of anyone's life. He exhaled slowly, or at least I was. Carl gave a knowing nod. Because sometimes the hardest part of being a hero was simply being seen as human again. The very next morning, an astonishing sight greeted Riverside. A line of customers stretched around the block. Veterans, military families, neighbors, teachers, all waiting patiently to be served by a man who had become something of a legend overnight. And guess who else was there? Yep, the same group of teenagers who had once mocked him, but now they were passing out flyers for a new fundraiser in support of wounded warriors. How's that for a turnaround? Have you ever made the right choice when everyone else walked away? One flyer asked. Your story matters too. Just a month later, a letter arrived for Daniel from the Pentagon. It was formal and full of official language, but the core message stood out. An invitation to a ceremony honoring battlefield medics and the possibility of finally awarding the Medal of Honor that had once been recommended for him. But Daniel didn't feel eager or excited. He folded the letter, gently placed it in his locker, and went back to work. You're not going? Mike asked when Daniel casually mentioned declining. I'm fine right here, Daniel said. I don't need medals or ceremonies. I just need normal days where people see me, not just my scars, not just my past. And indeed, the diner began to change, slowly but meaningfully. Customers who had once requested a different waiter now asked for Daniel's section specifically. Veterans still visited, but they no longer lingered in a way that made Daniel feel like a symbol. Instead, they treated him like a person. Daniel the waiter, not Doc the war hero. Then, on a Tuesday morning, Daniel found a small card resting on his break room chair. The handwriting was familiar. It read, Your scars are medals we cannot wear for you. It wasn't signed, but he knew it was from Alex. Looking through the service window, he saw Alex and his classmates seated quietly at a booth, notebooks open, listening intently to an off-duty paramedic demonstrating first aid techniques. Mike had donated the space for a weekly first aid class, inspired by Daniel. "Service seems like the least we could do," Mike had said with a shrug. Daniel watched the teenagers practice pressure bandages and tourniquets, the same life-saving skills he'd once used in combat. Something stirred deep within him. Could it be pride? Hope? Maybe there was value in being visible after all. Because honor doesn't reside in medals or uniforms. It lives in those who carry deep wounds but choose compassion. It lives in the quiet servers, the tired fathers, the kids who learn from their mistakes. Sometimes the person clearing your table once held someone's dying hand and whispered, "You're gonna make it," while chaos exploded all around. Have you ever been misjudged just because of how you looked? Have you ever carried a story too heavy to tell? Share it. Your truth matters, because through shared stories, honor is restored, and hearts are changed forever.